All right, so we're Yud Beis and Yud Beis, 12b. Yesterday we discussed, make sure you're looking at Sotah, not Nazir.
Yeah.
So yesterday we discussed the date at which Moshe Rabbeinu was retrieved from the floating in the river by Batya, the daughter of Parai, and either on the day that he would eventually receive the Torah, the 6th of Sivan, or on the day that he would eventually split the sea, which is the 21st of Nisan. And we discussed how we get to 3 months from his birth, right? Because we learned that his parents had a 3-month leeway to hide him, and that he was only put in the basket at 3 months old. So you have to figure out how there was 3 months between the 7th of Adar, which we know is his birthday, and the day at which he was retrieved by Batya. So 6th of Sivan is clear, that's 3 months. Nisan, Iyar, Sivan. But for the 21st of Nisan, we had to add an extra month of Adar by saying it was a leap year, and then we have most of the first Adar, full second Adar, and then most of Nisan. That's where we left off yesterday. Yud Beis and Yud Beis, 12b. So the Gemara now continues quoting the verse. The line begins with that. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 lines from the bottom of the page. So after she retrieves him and she says, this must be a Hebrew because she sees that he is circumcised. She says the word this because this is the one that's in the river, but nobody else is going to the river because the decree ended on that day. Right? The next verse reads that the sister of the baby, that is Miriam, told the daughter of Pharaoh, right? She was standing behind watching to see what's going to happen to Moshe Rabbeinu, right? Because she wanted to see what's going to happen with her prophecy, right? Because she prophesied that she was going to grow up to be we'll get to that soon actually. But she prophesied that this was going to be a leader, and now he's floating in the river. What's going to happen? So she was watching to see what would happen, and she observes the whole scene of Pharaoh's daughter taking in Moshe Rabbeinu, and when she declares this must be a Hebrew, she comes popping out from behind the reeds or wherever she was hiding to watch, and says, and the sister of the baby, Miriam, tells the daughter of Pharaoh, Ha'elech, do you want me to go? The Karasilach, and shall I call for you Isha Menekas, actually they called a wet nurse. A wet nurse was a woman to breastfeed the baby. Ivriya is from the Hebrew woman, end quote. So she offered to go bring a Jewish woman to feed the baby. And presumably the daughter of Pharaoh doesn't know that this is a sister. Just a random girl. She doesn't know necessarily there's a connection here. So the Gemara stops and comments. Why is she offering to bring a Hebrew midwife, a Hebrew wet nurse? Why not an Egyptian one? Wouldn't that be the first option? So presumably they already ruled that out. The Gemara explains that that's indeed what happened. Because Malamed, this indicates to us the fact that Miriam is offering to bring a Jewish midwife, a Jewish wet nurse. Malamed, this indicates Sherziru Moshe. They passed Moshe, the baby, Al Kola Mitzvahs Kulan, to all of the Egyptian available wet nurses, and he would not nurse. He would not drink from Egyptian woman.
Where on the page?
10 lines on the bottom. Second to last word, the last words. The next line begins with Amar.
Oh, okay.
So it should be a little above there, and then under it says Yeridea.
Oh, yeah.
So, got it?
Is there a star before it? Amar?
Yeah, the little star, yeah. So, the Miriam offering to bring a Hebrew midwife is because they already tried the Egyptian ones, and therefore she said, hey, do you want me to bring a Hebrew midwife, a wet nurse? Okay, so why wouldn't he drink from the Egyptian women? Milk is milk, right? So Amar, it was said. So this is interesting. The text over here in the Gemara does not tell us who said. It just says Amar. It was said. I'll comment on that in a second. It was said, the mouth that will eventually speak face to face with the presence of God, Yinik Dover Tameh, should drink and wean from something impure. That can't be. Why is something impure? So explains Rashi. Not because the women themselves are impure. This is an interesting point Rashi makes. Rashi could have just left it as is. They're not Jewish women, and that's impure. Finished. It explains Rashi, no. When a woman eats that food, or when anybody eats, that food becomes part of who they are. and then the food that this woman eats becomes eventually the milk that the baby will drink. This is physiologically true as well, which is why women nursing will not drink too much alcohol, because that will come through to the baby, right? Even though officially they say beer is good for milk, as they say. But I'm just saying that it comes through. And if that's the case, then Egyptian women eating non-kosher is going to be into Moshe's mouth. And then for the mouth that's going to speak to God is going to eat something not kosher through the milk of the mother, through the milk of the wet nurse. That can't be. So he wouldn't drink from these women, which is why Miriam offered to bring a Hebrew wet nurse. Now I said that the Gemara says Amar, it was said. It doesn't say who said. So the little star that you have in the Gemara there, or in my case, it's a little vav, indicates to us that in the Ein Yaakov is essentially a collection. The Gemara, it's a compilation of all the sections of the Gemara that are not related to Jewish law, but they're related to just stories, inspiration, this kind of stuff that we're learning in the Gemara here. So all that stuff is collected into Ein Yaakov. It's very fascinating, and I don't know if it's translated into English, but it used to be that those who didn't have a yeshiva background would often come to learn Ein Yaakov. Yalt Rebbe and Tanya encourages learning Ein Yaakov, and he says that the most of the secrets of Torah are embedded in these stories and inspiration that we're learning here, which is why we're constantly looking for a spiritual meaning in the Gemara here, because that's where it's to be found. So the Alter Rebbe encourages people should learn this. At any rate, over there, sometimes you'll find a slight variation of the text there as compared to the way we have in our Gemara.
What's it called?
Ein Yaakov. Ayin Yud Nun, one word, and then Yaakov.
It's my favorite because I like the stories in the Gemara. My favorite, and this is a compilation of just the stories.
Is it available in English?
No, I haven't seen.
Right. Anyway, it might be. At any rate, so over there, sometimes so we'll have the same story there as we'll have in our Gemara, but sometimes there's a slight variation in the text. So in the version of the text over there, it says that God said this statement. This statement which says that the mouth who is going to talk to God should not drink something that isn't kosher. The Ein Yaakov says that it was God speaking. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God said, the mouth that's going to talk to the presence of God should drink not kosher, and that's why he wouldn't drink. But our Gemara doesn't say that. Our version of the Gemara just says, Amar, it was said. And the implication is that Moshe Rabbeinu himself is saying this in our Gemara. It sounds like. So you could take on the version of the Ein Yaakov and say that it's just a few words missing in our Gemara, and it should say that God said this statement. But you could also interpret it just as the Gemara has it here, that Moshe Rabbeinu says it. Not that he's actually mouthing it, but his soul feels it. Moshe Rabbeinu's soul, which is perfectly in tune, as we already learned, the moment he was born, he was shining already, right? And we also learned that Yocheved, Moshe Rabbeinu's mother, was able to see on his face that he's going to be someone who is prophesizing the future time. So it could be his soul is so in tune to his mission that his soul wouldn't allow him to nurse from non-Jewish women, because his mouth is eventually going to talk to God. So that's what I'm saying. I'm giving two possibilities here. You can go with the possibility of the Ein Yaakov, which says that God is speaking this, God's saying, how could this mouth eat not kosher? Or you can go with the version of our Gemara here, which just says that, which seems to imply that Moshe Rabbeinu himself is saying this, is to say his soul itself feels that this is not the right thing to do.
Could this have come to Miriam?
Doesn't say,
She would be the one.
so only the Gemara seems to imply that only afterwards, after they tried giving to all the Egyptians and it was rejected because his mouth wouldn't drink that, because his mouth is destined to talk to God. Then Miriam interjects and says, hey, I'll get you a Jewish woman. And she brings, of course, his mother, Yocheved. Okay, let's just read the verse here. The Gemara cites to a verse to support this idea that the mouth that's going to speak to God should not drink not kosher. The Gemara cites to a verse which is in, let me pull it up, in Yeshayahu in Isaiah 28:9. And the verse reads, Esmi Yodedeya, who will instruct knowledge? Esmi Yavin Shmuel, who will understand a teaching? Gemule Mechalav, those who wean from milk, Atike Shadayim, those who suckled from the breasts, from the bosom. So the verse makes this correlation between speaking Torah and those who, and the fact that a baby suckles from the mother. And thus, the implication being that Hashem would teach, right? Actually, atika shadayim actually means the one who stayed away from the breasts. That is to say, he stayed away from the breasts that were not kosher. So that is to say, to whom does God instruct knowledge? Not who shall be the one to instruct, but to whom does God instruct knowledge? The one who stayed away from a bosom he wasn't supposed to. Okay, so this is a verse in Isaiah which supports this idea as it's quoted here. So I just want to highlight the following. So one of the 10 campaigns, I mentioned this yesterday, one of the 10 campaigns of the Rebbe, right, this is the campaign of tefillin. We all know it's stopping people on the street to put on tefillin. There's the campaign of Torah study, which we're doing now, right? These campaigns aren't the Rebbe's ideas, right? These are mitzvahs that existed before, right, but they were turned them into a campaign. That is to say that pushing his followers on all Jews to take on this mitzvah.
Done.
Sorry?
To get it more done.
Yeah. So it's the 10, not mitzvahs, but the 10 mifza with a vase, tzaddik, ayin. So it's mem, vase, tzaddik, ayin, which means campaign. Like in Hebrew, when you see a store has a campaign 50% off, they'll call it mifza.
Okay.
It's just a campaign. But it's the mitzvah mifzas, right? It's the mitzvah campaigns. At any rate, one of the 10 campaigns is kosher. Now, the campaign for kosher came along with the announcement of the campaign for family purity, which Robert spoke about on Shabbos. When they introduced these campaigns, both of these, they were addressed mostly to Jewish women, and they were addressed mostly to creating a home environment that's conducive to raising healthy Jewish children. And they were talked actually somewhat a little bit harshly, not harshly, I would say, but somewhat strong-worded, if you will, about the state of Jewish affairs and this idea that the generations aren't successful at producing Jewish identities in the same way they were in previous generations. And they cited 2 issues. First of all, from birth, there's a problem. If the child is conceived without mikveh, then our sages teach us, especially in Kabbalistic works, that it gives a lavush, the soul remains pure, supposed to say. The soul remains pure, period, no matter what happens. But its packaging is different. Every soul's packaging is different, a different personality. Right? Both of us have pure, godly souls, but we're very, very different in our personalities. And that packaged personality comes from the parents. The soul itself comes from God. God decides what kind of soul you're going to get. But the packaging, the personality comes from the parents, specifically the way they conduct themselves at conception and even during pregnancy. And because of that, family purity becomes so important, so that you give the child a wholesome and healthy personality, Jewish personality that's conducive for expressing a godly soul. At the end of the day, the child is born, even if the parents did not conduct themselves appropriately during conception. Nonetheless, the child has free choice. The child can overcome whatever challenges he was born by his parents, because deep down he has a pure soul which can overcome. And then the Rebbe adds as follows. And this is what the campaign for kosher comes about. If you want to provide the child with the opportunity, or the power, the strength to be able to overcome whatever negative influence exists in his life and to allow for his godly soul to come out, then the child, it's extremely important that the child and the parents as well eat kosher. Because as we're learning here, the food you eat becomes you, becomes part of who you are. And if it becomes part of who you are, then part of both your full physiology, your physical and your character, right? So the soul is pure, but we're trying to refine the character so that the soul can be expressed. And that's where kosher eating comes in. Right? It goes so far. This is not halacha, but the Shalah, the famous Shalah, Rabbi Horowitz, the author of the Shnei Luchos Habris, the book called Shnei Luchos Habris, which is the acronym for which is Shin Lamed He, which is why it's called the Shalah. But
what's that book about?
It's mostly a Kabbalistic work, but also halachic in nature somewhat. A lot of Tanya is built on the Shalah, actually. Shalah and the Maral, those are two influencers on Tanya. At any rate, the Shalah writes that he talking about this idea how the person takes on his character is formed by what he eats, which is the spiritual idea behind kosher, and he therefore says that kosher animals in general are docile. We don't eat predators. Right? Most kosher animals are not predators. Because that's the kind of character we want to incorporate. We don't incorporate the character of hostility, a predatory characters. So he once saw apparently a turkey. He once saw a turkey eating another animal, and therefore he said, if I had the power, I would tell all Jews not to eat turkey anymore. I see it being wild. I see it being predatory, but at least my children shouldn't. I have one friend, at least one friend, who traces his ancestry to the Shalah, and their family does not eat turkey.
Yeah. I remember hearing this story before.
Their family does not eat turkey because the Shalah writes he doesn't want his children to eat turkey because he saw they have bad character. I'm not saying you shouldn't eat turkey, but I'm making this point. I'm demonstrating this point that eating kosher is about we incorporate the physical food becomes incorporated to our flesh and blood, and so does the character that the food brings with it.
Right.
Whether it's animal or not animal, even if it's non-kosher food, has spiritual energy that has negative effect on who we are. This even goes to what the mother eats and its effect on the baby, to the point that this is even mentioned in halacha, in Jewish law. So in Jewish law, I closed it. No, I didn't close the page. Okay, it's here. Yoda Deya.
What do you think about fish that eat non-kosher fish in interest of as
You
their
don't
part
eat.
of their diet?
You don't eat predatory fish. Non-kosher fish aren't predatory.
No, but let's say salmon and tuna.
Salmon eat other fish.
Well, all fish eat other fish.
I'm not so sure.
To
Do they?
survive, no?
Yeah, all the other fish. They don't eat like insects
Yeah,
and.
they'll probably eat smaller fish.
Yeah.
Big minerals.
Okay.
It's fish with minerals.
Look, if Torah says the fish is kosher, the fish is kosher.
Yeah.
Period.
Exactly.
So that's the end of that.
Yeah. No, I know. I'm not questioning its kosher. I'm just saying, in that vein.
Yeah.
So I would say I don't know this. I don't know the spiritual makeup, but I would suppose that as the fish incorporates it into its body, it becomes cleansed for us to eat. I assume because
Right.
Torah says it's kosher, right?
Right.
But here's something interesting in halacha. This is in Yoda Deya. That is right. The Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, has 4 sections. One of them is called Yoda Deya, and in the section of Yoda Deya, it discusses the laws of kosher. And there, in chapter 81, verse section 7, if you'd like to look it up, and this is the gloss from the Ramah. From the Ramah. So there's discussing about the fact that a woman's milk is kosher to drink a woman's milk. Obviously, an adult shouldn't take directly from the breast, but if it was in a cup, in theory, an adult can drink it. And discusses the laws relating to how long a baby should nurse from the mother. And then the Ramah adds the following gloss. The Ramah, of course, is Rabbi Moshe Isserles, right? The Code of Jewish Law is written by Rabbi Yosef Cairo, who predominantly wrote it with the Sephardic custom in mind, as he was a Sephardi. So Rabbi Moshe Isserles, instead of writing a whole new code for Ashkenaz, just added glosses to the Ramah, indicating where the Ashkenaz custom diverges from the Sephardic custom, or when the Sephardic commentary from Rabbi Cairo didn't cover everything that he wanted to cover. So here he has the following gloss.
You're descendant of it.
Sorry?
The great Rabbi Carol.
Oh, yeah. So the great Talmudist, Halachist, and Kabbalist. People don't know that about him. For some reason, they don't talk about that fact that he was a major Kabbalist,
Wow, I didn't know.
student of the Rizal. Yeah, he has a whole book called Magid Meisharim, I think it's called. And it's basically things that he wrote about a soul or an angel from heaven that would come to him and teach him Torah. And he writes down what he learned from them. Very Kabbalistic in nature. People all think of him as the rationalist and the halachist. They don't realize that he was a very spiritual man and full of Kabbalah. But anyway, having said that. Anyway, so Moshe Isserles writes to follow the Ramah in his gloss on Yoda Deya 81:7, writes that a person that, non-kosher milk, milk from a non-Jewish woman is just as kosher, halachically speaking, as a Jewish woman's milk, because milk is milk that comes from a woman. But nonetheless, he writes that a baby should not drink from a non-Jewish woman because it causes the heart to be closed. And moreover, he says, and likewise, a Jewish woman, if she is nursing a baby, should be extra scrupulous to make sure that what she eats is kosher, because that food goes through to the baby. And this itself, he says, because all of this causes causes him damage in his older age. A child's very fragile. Everything was not fragile is the wrong word, but very sensitive, right? Everything you tell a child and everything you give to a child has its effect later in life. something that you find something that someone tells you that might be offensive, you might take a day or two to shake it off. A child may have a much deeper scar, right? Same thing is true of food. And the spiritual effect of non-kosher food on the child, even if it comes through the mother's milk, is an effect that lasts way into his old age. And that is built from our Gemara that we learned here, that Moshe Rabbeinu would not drink from a non-Jewish woman because she consumed non-kosher food, because this is a mouth that's going to talk to God. Because the effect of what a child eats and what a child sees and what a child engages with has a long-lasting effect, to the point, just to take it one step further and conclude with this, the Rabbi even made it called or requested or promoted this idea that children shouldn't even see non-kosher animals. The books in our home should not have non-kosher animals in it. Toys should not be of non-kosher animals. You want the visual, all the content that the child takes in, whether through vision, through sound, or through food, should be of a wholesome nature. And as you develop the child's and try to strengthen the child's purity that is naturally born with. And once the child's older, the adult is older, he's more capable of discerning this is okay and this is not okay. Then you see non-kosher animals, you know where you stand on it. But a child is much more sensitive, and therefore the child's surrounding and all the content it takes in, whether through eyes, ears, or mouth, should be pure and wholesome, so that we bolster and strengthen the child's purity. And this is all built or connected to the Gemara we're learning here, that Moshe Rabbeinu, the mouth that would talk to God, should not eat not kosher. And we hope that all of our children's mouths talk to God, right? Even though they're not speaking on Moshe Rabbeinu's level, but nonetheless, the relationship with God we want our children to have, and that has to be inculcated from a young age.
How do you teach a child about the snake and the early stories?
So if it's in Torah, it's Torah. So if it's Torah, it's Torah, and we don't hide, God forbid, any part of Torah from the children. Even in illustration, because you're learning Torah. So now it's not a non-kosher animal, it's a Torah animal. When you're teaching the kids the law of kosher, and you're showing which bird the Torah is talking about when it says which birds are kosher or non-kosher, you're not giving non-kosher animals, you're giving the Torah, you're giving the child kosher, you're giving the child kosher because it's Torah. But just playing as a toy is something different. Because Torah is Torah.
Different environments.
Also, when Torah talks about non-kosher animals, it's not non-kosher. It's Torah. What's the content the child's consuming? Torah.
Right.
It's all about what content is the child consuming.
Right.
The child's consuming Torah content. But if it's a toy snake and a toy lion, then it has nothing to do with Torah.
Right.
The child's consuming the content represented by these animals, as opposed to content of Torah. That's a good question, though. And actually, I've been encouraged not to hide any part of Torah. Torah is Torah. Even when Torah talks about intimacy, Torah is Torah. You teach the child as is.
Why did God tell Moshe or Aaron to put the snake on top of his?
I don't know why. I mean, it's last week's parsha.
Yeah.
The commentaries talk about what exactly the significance of the snake is. On the basic level, Rashi says that God wanted them to teach them to look up for healing, look to God. But there's other representation of the snake itself, and why that is. It's a kind of representation of this idea that God's healing is not just an antidote to sickness, but comes from the very sickness itself, and that's transformative. Today we have that in modern science as well. Inoculation, vaccines, that's what they are.
Right.
You take the sickness itself and use that to heal. So this is like an early representation of that, or a spiritual representation of that. That the serpent itself, which is the source of sickness, itself gets transformed into the source of healing.
Wow.
So, this is God's method of healing is to transform the sickness itself.
Right.
That's one representation, but there's many others. I just want to say this before I close this, that I just said that they've been encouraged that we teach the text as is, even if it talks about intimacy or whatnot. Obviously, it's got to be age appropriate, and discuss with professionals before you start talking to your children at 6 years old about intimacy. There are ways to say it, and there are words you can use and whatnot. But in concept, one doesn't hide from Torah, because you just teach the child to it's just not a healthy thing. You teach the child, this is good in Torah, but that's not good in Torah. Torah is Torah, and it's all good.
Right. You don't want them to have
Finished.
negative feelings towards Torah.
That's number one. And you also don't want them to, oh, you're hiding it from me, so there must be something there that I want to know.
Right.
And then they find out from the back door, and then who knows what kind of information they get from the back door,
Right.
as opposed to hearing it from you in a healthy kind of way.
Right.
So talk to professionals before any of you talk to your children, and You can see me privately if you have any questions about that, because I've done this a little bit of research, because I have children myself.
Right.
Um,
When the time is right.
it's age appropriate. There's ways to talk about it to children at all ages, and you have to know what language to use.
Right, exactly, yeah.
Anyway,
Just go
Yeah.
back to that part about you said that shouldn't drink milk from a non-Jewish woman
Mhm.
because it closes the heart.
that's the quote from the Ramah, yeah.
Any interpretation of what exactly that means?
What exactly Tzimtzum Halev means, closing heart means? It means that,
Compassionate.
I think it means a sensitivity towards spirituality, and compassion included. I think it means a sensitivity towards spirituality and godliness in general. One needs to have a certain sensitivity, right? If a person's life is very materialistic, I want to explain what I mean by materialistic. Materialistic doesn't just mean that I like to eat and I'm gluttonous. It's a very coarse version of materialism. There's also a sense of materialism in which a person learns about something and is incapable of discerning the abstraction of it, right? For example, a person learns about angels. So a materialistically oriented person wants to know how many wings it has and what the color of the wings are, right? And maybe you'll find texts that talk about the colors of the wings and what they look like. I'm sure there are texts that way. But when you're learning those texts, it's not about the color or the actual, that's very materialistic, right? It's an ethereal concept. It's a conceptual being, not conceptual being, but it's an ethereal being. It's a metaphysical being. And a person has to have the capacity, the sensitivity to be able to abstract from the information somewhat of a non-materialistic entity. I'll give an example. Just to give an example.
Isn't it like circumcising your heart?
Yeah, exactly. Precisely. That's what circumcising the heart is, to be able to have
Circumcise the heart?
Yeah, exactly.
Figure out what it is.
Precisely, the idea of circumcising the heart is the opposite of blocked heart. The idea is to have sensitivity. So I'm going to give you an example that we can all follow to demonstrate what I mean of having a sensitivity.
Relinquishing the ego.
In some ways, like letting yourself go of the entrapments of the bodily understanding of things. I'll give an example. When a child learns 1 + 1 = 2. So what does a child think about? Thinks of two apples, one apple and another apple. As you get older, you start to understand that's not about apples and oranges. It's a concept.
Right.
The idea of 1 + 1 = 2 transcends any particular apple or any particular item. It's a concept. Now, if you close your eyes now and think of 1 + 1 = 2, because you are trapped in a physical body, you have no choice but to think about its physical manifestation. Try to picture 1 + 1 = 2 without thinking of two objects. You can't, because you live in the world of objects, and we live in the world of the physical. Our minds are invested in the physical brain. So we have no choice but to think of it in very physical terms. But even as you think of them in physical terms, you have the sensitivity to understand that's not a physical thing we're talking about here. It's a conceptual thing. And we acknowledge the entrapments of our physical understanding of it and understand we're talking about something that transcends the physical. Now, this is all related to 1 + 1 = 2, which is in no way divine, which isn't like godly or like an angel, right? So times that by infinity, when you're learning about angels, when you're learning about God himself, even though you use words like kindness, intelligence, greatness, you have to remember to abstract it from their meaning as we have them.
Right.
And even though we have no choice but to think of them in terms of how we experience them, but at least be aware and sensitive to the fact that this is something larger, this is something greater, this is something that we can't touch or really explain because it's metaphysical. And that's what I mean by not being materialistic.
Open-mindedness.
That's right. So it's open-mindedness
More
and
than that.
it's open-heartedness. That's the point here. Because a mind is intellectual. This is a sensitivity towards something that's beyond intellect. Because our intellect is trapped in our physical also, right? Like using the example of 1 + 1 = 2. We're trapped in thinking about it in two objects because that's the way we used to live our world, in objects. But we have the sensitivity beyond just the intelligence. It's a sensitivity to realize that this is a concept that goes beyond the physical. And that's what I think he means by a blocked heart. Lacks a sensitivity toward the abstract, lacks a sensitivity towards spirituality. And everything becomes like, well, what is it? Can I touch it? Can I see it? It's like there are things you can't touch and see, but you can still kind of sense them of their existence and be aware of their existence, right?
Same way.
So I think that's what it means.
Same way a kid grows up, 1 + 1 = 2, 1 + 1 = 2.
Right, exactly.
1 + 1 = 2, no matter what you're talking about. And then the kid gets married and the rabbi says 1 + 1 = 1.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah, that requires a sensitivity to be able to, right? That's right. So
Open-mindedness.
that's right. So a spiritual sensitivity like that is actually, or lack thereof, is a big problem in marriage. When you're not capable of, like, you hear your wife's words, but you said this, without being able to, like, sense there's something more than just the words going on here. And in
Right.
her heart, she's feeling something that you're trying to touch, and trying to sense, and trying to feel, as opposed to breaking down. But you said this, but you didn't say that. It's like,
Yeah.
stop getting so technical. Be a little sensitive to that which is beyond the technical, right?
Right.
That's what a blocked heart is, incapable of getting that sense.
Empathetic, yeah.
Yes, empathy requires a certain open-heartedness.
Right.
Similar, because you have to be sensitive to beyond the technical, to start to
Right.
feel somebody else. What are they feeling? What's
And-
going on? What's wrong with it?
And
what's bothering
furthermore,
them?
also not just looking for a solution, not just presenting the solution right away to whatever you're saying.
Right. So like if you're an engineer and you approach your relationship as an engineer, and every time you hear something, you take the words, try to dissect it and fix the problem.
Right, exactly, yeah.
You know, and it lacks a certain sensitivity.
Things, yeah.
It lacks a sensitivity, right?
Yeah,
It lacks a sensitivity. So I think this is all related to this idea of blocked heart. Not being able to sense that which is beyond the tangibility and the technical.
Make an appointment, we'll discuss this.
Yeah.
what I was thinking of actually was that, do you think it's fair to say then at best man's understanding or everything that the Torah says is an analogy for of human understanding?
Absolutely. So Torah is called Mashal HaKadmoni, the primordial example. In other words, all of Torah in some ways is a metaphor for what's really going on.
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Because it's man who's learning it.
Precisely.
And
then when
limited it to a human understanding.
I'll tell you even more. When you learn an example in Chassidus, a metaphor in Chassidus about some spiritual concept,
Right.
what you're really learning is a metaphor for a metaphor.
Yes.
Because you're thinking of the metaphor, and then how do you translate it?
Right.
You translate the metaphor into the truth of spirituality? Not really.
No, of course.
Because whatever you envision is still a metaphor for what's really going on.
Right.
So you have to have like a double abstraction,
Right.
a double capability for abstraction, and it requires a lot of sensitivity. And that's part of it, is eating kosher and just in general being sensitive about how we eat, right? The more materialistically engaged a person becomes, it in some ways ruins the sensitivity, because you become so like all your senses are invested in the materialistic that it ruins your ability to be able to feel that which is beyond the material, right? This is a big part of why in Chassidus it talks about iskafia, which is self-control, to not engage in every materialistic whim and desire. Because the more you engage in these materialistic whims and desires, the more your sensitivity gets attached to the materialistic, and it loses sensibility to the spiritual, to the
Even the permitted.
even the permitted, yeah, to self-control even when it's permitted, to allow yourself to be a little bit more sensitive. In fact, the verse that Tanya cites to for this idea of being sensitive is Kadesh atzmacha b'mutlach, which is a verse, which is make yourself holy even that which is permitted. Because by refraining from engaging in materialism, even when it's permitted, allows for a certain holiness, allows you to be a little more sensitive to that which is beyond. And certainly at the level of keeping kosher, and this is what we're getting here to Moshe Rabbeinu, that even the milk he drank from a non-Jewish woman would affect him in his later relationship with God, and certainly for all of us as well.
I remember Rabbi New was giving this fascinating example. I just remember it vividly. He was saying that he says that when a person drinks coffee, not they're not allowed to drink coffee. You should have coffee and enjoy coffee and drink it, you know.
Right.
But if somebody comes and takes it away, and you're like, "Hey, that's my coffee," that's where the problem is, you know, because you have this now attachment to it. Where
It's my coffee? Who made it your coffee?
Yeah, or it's like it's just coffee, you know.
Right.
At the end of the day.
Yeah, I'm going to conclude with a story from the fifth Chabad Rebbe. So, you know, we learn in Tanya about eating with the intention of elevating the spark in the food that we're eating. Right, this is a very lofty sensitivity to, you know, instinctually we eat because we're hungry, and then we have to like remind ourselves, hold on a second, yes, you're eating because you're hungry, but you should have in mind that we're eating here to elevate the sparks that are in the foods, that we can take the sparks that's in the food, incorporate that into our lives, and then use that for Torah study and so on. So the fifth Chabad Rebbe was once eating, you know, meat or chicken, something like that. I for sure should share the story with you. And he picked up a piece of meat in his fork, and it fell off the fork. And he said, obviously, the spark of divine energy that's in that fork, that's in that food, is not ready to be elevated, and he wouldn't eat that piece. It's a spiritual sensitivity that I don't know that. Certainly, I don't think I can ever get to that level. I'm just giving you an idea of how far it can
The
go.
fork wasn't elevated enough to pick up your hand.
I don't know. I'm just telling you what he said. The piece of meat fell off the fork, and therefore he said, obviously, that piece of meat is not ready for elevation, and didn't eat that piece. God forbid. God forbid. Anyway, okay, wonderful day, everybody. And we can bring about this for who knows how.
Wasn't there another story? I don't remember the story
Yeah.
very well. Everybody was sitting around, Hasidim sitting around the table, serving ice cream and giving ice cream. It says, "This is ice cream."
Oh, no, this is a story. Yes, I shared this story. This story is Rabbi Nissim Nemanov. It's like also a great story about sensitivity. Rabbi Nissim Nemanov is a famous mashpia mentor, originally in Russia and then later in France. When Hasidim left Russia, or many of them left Russia in 45 to go to France, my father's family included. Anyway, so he was a famous mentor, and he was an actual Beinoni of Tanya. Well, in Tanya, Beinoni is someone who has 24/7 self-control. That's him, 24/7 self-control. And he was known to be a very, what's the word, like a pious, certainly, but also very strong-armed, not so strong, but he was very strict mentor. And he was very strict on his students, very stern. His students loved him. By people, I met his students. I never met him, obviously. He died before I was born, but I met his students, and they loved him. But he was very strict. So anyway, he heard that the boys like ice cream, marozhina in Russian. And by Fabrengens, he would talk about, you don't have to have ice cream, you don't need it. Trying to tell the boys to have self-control, as we're talking about here, so they can have sensitivity to spirituality. Run after the ice cream. Anyway, so one time by Fabrengens, someone served ice cream. So he got a bowl of ice cream in front of him. He started eating it. And his students came to him and said, you're eating ice cream. You talk about ice cream all the time. You're eating ice cream. And he said, this is ice cream? He's been telling the boys all the time not to indulge in ice cream. He had no idea what it was. He had no idea what it was. He just heard that the boys wanted too much, so he was telling them to slow down. And now he has it. He's like, oh, ice cream, okay, it's ice cream. He had no idea what it was. So that's a spiritual sensitivity. God doesn't even know what ice cream is, Anyway. So they just give you an idea. They say about him, if you ever seen his face, physically speaking, his features were not very beautiful. But I've heard from a few people that when he would fabring, and he would lead a fabring, and his face was red and shining, and like you couldn't take your eyes off him. Right. I've heard this from a few people that they couldn't take his eyes off him, and so long as he was fabringing, you felt like nothing in the world existed but God. I heard this from a few people about him. His fabringings were like something of a different level. Rabbi Nissim Nemanov, that was his name. Very famous, iconic figure in Chabad, from the previous generation. Okay, wonderful day, everybody.
There is